Hey, Mark, how's it going? This is the 51st episode, if you can believe it or not.
Good morning, Dan. I was actually just thinking that to myself a little earlier today. I
Yeah.
know we started this off because we wanted to just get interacting with people, but we've made it to 51 shows and we've got two more scheduled and a lot more happening. So
Yeah.
exciting times.
No, this is great. I think now that we're 50 plus, we can start numbering the shows, right? Because it makes it seem, it's more legitimate at this point. Uh,
I know, right?
just joking there. No, we have a great show. Fred John will come on in a minute. He's a longtime industry vet talking about storytelling and market research, which we were chatting before the show. And I think it's one of the most important things that
Yep.
researchers can do is effectively tell the story around the data. But first, Mark, I know we have some announcements of different things coming up. I just want to make sure that everyone knows what we're up to. So, do you have some links to things? I know next week on Live with Dan, we'll be doing kind of a Q&A show around
Yep.
consumer trends in 2022. We did a webinar a couple weeks ago, but there were so many questions that we got that next Friday we'll kind of turn this into a Q&A hour with Steve Krause and John Lass. So those guys will be coming
Yep.
on. They were on the webinar, and we'll be doing that. And then in 2 weeks, we have another special guest that we'll be talking to around online focus groups versus online focus groups versus
This is offline.
in-person
Yep.
focus groups. So that'll
Yep.
be interesting. We'll announce her next week, but that is coming up. So a lot of things happening here, and then I know there's a lot of other things that Question Pro is doing as a whole as well. So make
Yep.
sure you tune in and check out everything we're doing.
I am not posting the links over here because I'm hoping that people can actually, and I think you should maybe subscribe to our channel. We've
Okay.
got all of these already up on our page. If you subscribe, then you'll know what we're actually even talking about. In fact, just this morning, even even Shibani did a very interesting Experience Matter show with MPL on actually communities and how they're leveraging communities for continuous discovery. I know, Dan, you did this long form white paper with Ray Pointer of
Yeah.
UMR, right, on continuous discovery. So I'm going to put the link to that one. You should definitely check that out. But if you follow our live channels, you'll see a lot of different interesting conversations that were happening with different people. So just follow and subscribe. We're everywhere.
Yeah, and we'll be even in more places coming up soon here. So Mark and I have been talking a lot
Absolutely.
about getting more out there and different channels and so forth. So a lot's happening there. Mark, why don't we go ahead and bring in Fred John here?
Absolutely.
Fred John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate.
No, we're very happy to have you. So, Fred, I know you've been in the industry a while, from Mastercard to running your own firm now. Can you give people just kind of a brief overview of your background and what your interests are in market research?
Let's say it's been over 40 years. I've stopped
Okay.
counting.
Okay.
Started basically on the supplier side, worked for a number of companies, and longest time was with Yankelovich Partners, where I ran their overseas affiliate network and did a fair amount of custom work. Strong emphasis on B2B, more than traditional consumer stuff. And then I spent about a dozen years at MasterCard, where it was one form of plastic or another.
Right.
But again, a lot of international work. So I got into cultural differences, attitudes to a debt and borrowing, that kind of thing. And then I set up my own company, Consilience Research, again, about 10 years ago, and focused on professional training, writing, as well as project work.
Interesting. No, I love that. I love that. So you had a new book come out in November, right?
Yes.
Titled Storytelling and Market Research, a Practical User Guide. Now, I love the practical user guide aspect of it because it's not only a book about storytelling and research, but it makes it user friendly as well to actually apply that. So maybe can you talk about some of the key takeaways from the book, because I love the power. I think I read somewhere that you wrote this where you mentioned the power that can be harnessed in research reports and presentation from storytelling. So that's something I'm really interested in, as I mentioned earlier in the intro. But what are some of the key takeaways? Why did you write the book? Can you spend a little bit of time talking about that?
Sure. Basically, the book operates on a number of different levels. And it actually started more as an article that grew into a book, which was that the term story and storytelling have multiple meanings. And I thought I would be helpful to clarify them.
Okay.
Just to give you two examples, when a client says, "So what's the story?" They don't want a long explanation. They want to find out what is the most important thing you've learned in terms of how it affects me. So that could be usually expressed in a couple sentences, no numbers, thank you. But people also say we want more of a story, use storytelling. They mean, what is the narrative? How do you explain everything you've learned? How do you lay it out in an interesting way? And of course, most market research deliverables, both reports and presentations, tend to be deadly dull for reasons I'll go into.
Right.
So I look to storytelling as a way of enlivening these deliverables, bringing them to life. And to do that, I had to really explore why a story is so powerful. And we all know stories are universal. We're exposed to them as infants. And throughout our lives, we experience them in different forms. And the part of their power is they not only entertain, they can teach, but they can get us to relate to situations outside our own cultures or experience. So you can read the Arabian Nights, you can read something from another century, from Shakespeare or whatever, and you can still relate to it, even though it's totally different from your own experience. And that power of storytelling can be harnessed, but of course it requires a really good storyteller. Not all of us are Shakespeare.
Right.
And so it's how do you apply some of that learning, some of that skill into your market research. And that was the essence of the book. And it becomes, as you said, a very hands-on user guide with a lot of examples. And that's what much of the book is about.
Nice.
And so, the first thing is to really understand what gives stories such power. And the two aspects that I focus on. One is that stories basically help you pull you in and shut out the rest of the world. So while you're reading an article, a book, or at the theater, the rest of the world kind of goes away temporarily. The other is that, as I already alluded to, stories can get you to relate to and even care about characters who never existed. So, you may cry over a sad ending about a people that never existed. That's the power of stories. How do you take that power and put it into one of the world's most boring deliverables? So that was my task.
I think that is the punchline for the book right there, Fred. I
Absolutely.
mean, if you can do that, like you're onto something. It's funny you mentioned, the power of stories and, being upset around a book. I remember, recently my daughter was reading this series, and the lead character, the one that she, loved in the book, ended up dying in the story, and she was like crushed for days because she was so invested in it, and the story was so real to her that it was she didn't want to talk about it. So it's interesting how stories like that can really grab you. So I definitely know what you mean there. One of the things, Fred, that you mentioned to me that's important is the open and helping to pull the audience in initially. Can you spend a little time and reflect on that for us?
I think all stories that succeed have a hook. They really have to pull you in from the beginning. And this could be on many different forms. You're reading a newspaper, a magazine, scrolling online. Something grabs your attention. Might be a headline. And then you go ahead and read the first paragraph of the article. If that doesn't pull you in, you're gone. Similarly with a book, you see the title, sounds interesting. Maybe there's a blurb, maybe a little, some upfront stuff that sounds intriguing, but it's the first few pages that either win or lose. And so it's very important to start in a way that grabs your attention and holds it long enough so you feel, hey, I'm being pulled out of the real world, and now I'm entering something else that I really enjoy being. The same as, of course, if you're going through channels and seeing different TV programs that are offered or something like that.
Yeah.
It's the very beginning that either holds you or not. When we think about typical mystery, how did it start? It almost always starts with a dead body. And you want to know who's this person, who did it, and why. And it's the why that gets you to, go through the whole procedure. So stories beginning are very important. Now in research, our documents, which let's say start with a research report, which is written, they open up with a statement of this is the background and objectives for the research, which is in many cases lifted directly from the RFP that launched the study. And it's usually very, very brief and not very interesting. It'll basically say, we the client want to launch a new shampoo line, and we're interested to know how it might do. Okay. That doesn't tell you much. Then you have a methodology, which only the researchers are interested in, and then you have a summary of findings. By now, you haven't pulled people in, you probably pushed them away. And so how do you make something like this more engaging? Well, the statement of the background and objectives is really a situation analysis. And you can make it a very dramatic situation. Here is a client. They're faced with a competitive scenario. They have competitors that are coming out with new products, the trends in the industry, their new populations that they have to attract. What do they do? And you can make it into a situation where a hero goes out and tries to, battle with their competitors. What do they have to know in order to do this? So you can lay it out in a dramatic form, and then you put the methodology as much of as possible into the appendix. And similarly, you do have to have an upfront summary of findings, but start with some pretty stark statement like, our research found some very important information that'll help you become much more profitable.
Right.
And then you have to give the summary.
Because everybody would be interested in that, right? Like if you found some information to help a company become more profitable, like that's the hook right there, right? So you do need a hook, and you do need to literally pull them through a few sections before you get into the real narrative. Now, if you look at the presentation, there's a lot more you can do, and it's a lot more problematic. Now, people who show up at a presentation very often walk into a room at different times. They check their devices, they chat with people. The presenter stands up, tries to get their attention, takes a while. Then the presenter does the same thing the report does. Gives them the background in a boring form, goes through the methodology. Then the worst thing they can do is give them a summary of findings. But now you've totally lost your audience before you've really begun. Right.
So think of the theater. When you make this more of an event where the presentation, people walk in, the lights are out. The only thing you can see is the screen. And instead of showing a lot of slides, you basically show the background summary and your methodology very briefly. So when people are forced to look forward, the presenter stands up and again starts with a very stark statement. I'm glad you're here today because you'll really find by the end of the show we have some great information that's going to make you a much more profitable, make your
very interesting
initiative more powerful.
Yeah. What I love about that, Fred, is you're not only telling the story, but you are sort of encapsulating the whole experience, right? Like turn the lights off, making sure they're focusing here. You're kind of bringing them into the presentation before you even start it, right? So I think that's an interesting aspect that's outside of the presentation, but like I mentioned, kind of creating that whole experience around it.
And again, it goes back to storytelling, the desire to pull people away from their real world. But you got to keep them. And one way to do that is what I call the manipulation of expectation, which is to promise something but don't deliver right away. So you could, say something like, we studied 5 different concepts and we identified the one that's a clear winner for you. But don't tell them yet what it is.
Right.
Say, well, let's go through some other things. Or you could say this set of findings, in the middle of the presentation, these set of findings have some really important implications for you. But before talking about those, let's look at some other findings that are relevant.
Mhm.
So again, you're creating an expectation, and it's teasing them in a way, but it's
Yeah.
a way of holding their attention where you really want them to go is the last part, which is your conclusions and your recommendations, which is what does this research mean to you, the client, specifically to you, and what should you do about it? That's why they're there.
Right. And that makes
Everything else
perfect
is
sense.
leading up to that.
Right, right. And I think another way to hold their attention, you had mentioned to me around the use of metaphors or exaggeration,
Mhm.
right? Like, can you
Yep.
spend a little bit of time on that and the importance around the metaphors and using that in your research and
Well,
storytelling?
researchers tend to be very literal. It's numbers based. It's
Yep.
very precise. But you're not delivering a scientific paper. This is a business document
Yep.
or a business presentation, and particularly in the live presentation, you can exaggerate.
Mm.
And we use exaggeration all the time. I have a ton of paperwork. Well, it's really not a ton. I
Mhm.
waited, forever at the DMV. Well, it was only 2 hours. That was the biggest fish ever caught in the ocean. Well, it
Right.
wasn't. What you're communicating is the sense of something that other people can relate to. And again, when a good story gets you to relate to the material or the characters. So exaggerating, which is a form of reductionism, really gets them to relate to the experience that you really overworked or you
Mm.
really had a long time to wait.
Right.
And metaphors are a very good way of communicating that. So if you say someone is a bull in a china shop, everyone knows what you mean.
Yeah.
And so you can use the metaphors, for example, to describe competitors in in an industry. You could refer to the top dog or the leader of the pack. You might say a new concept is a home run.
Hmm.
Or you might say, well, this ad landed like a lead balloon. You get the idea.
Right.
It'll depend very much on what you're trying to communicate. But a way of getting at these metaphors is thinking, what is a literal way I could describe what I'm trying to communicate? And then what is maybe a less literal way of communicating that sense, that feeling about whatever it is I'm talking about, whether it's a situation or an idea or a trend or a competitor.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I love the use of metaphors
Interesting.
because it definitely helps bring people in and people relate to them, like you mentioned. So
Mhm.
like the bull in a china shop, everyone knows what that means.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I like your example of, well, I waited forever at the DMV. Well, if you waited forever, you'd still be there, right? So people
Uh,
use these all the time without thinking about it, right? So
yeah, and it feels like you're there forever.
yeah, it does. It does.
So I've
Um,
heard.
yeah. One of the things I like, I was peeking at the chapters in your book, and one of them I think was around the client narrative and why that's so important. Can you talk a little about that, Fred, and kind of relating back to that client narrative?
Yeah, and it relates a little bit to what I've already talked about. There
Okay.
are two narratives. One
Yep.
is a narrative that how you share the information of your learning. And, that's a central part of your presentation or your report. And that's generally around a pretty tactical sense.
Mhm.
It's a go, no, don't go decision, that kind of thing.
Right.
The client narrative is everything I talked about before, which is related not only to this particular question, but the bigger picture. What is their position in the market? What is the brand's position? What are the competitive pressures?
Hmm.
Where does a company really want to go? What are the trends affecting it? And in order to link the two, you have to understand why the client, for example, is doing this research at this time. What decisions will be made with the research? What are
Right.
the risks involved? What is the opportunities they perceive? So it's a matter of basically framing your often tactical conclusions to the much larger picture of how does this fit into your client narrative, your situation, and your larger strategy, which means you have to do a lot of homework besides looking at your own research to understand what's really going on and really understanding perhaps what the risks are for the client if something fails.
Right.
And in fact, you may even come up with something where your learning points them in one direction, but their biggest strategy may not fit their biggest strategy. So you may have tested the viability of their entering into the Australian market, for example. And you might say, hey, looks like a great opportunity, but you're not doing so well in your home market. Do you really want to focus on building a presence in a foreign market while you're losing share at home?
Right. Right.
Okay. So in order to understand that, you need to know the full narrative.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And I think if you can sort of articulate the client narrative or pull that in, it's another way to keep them engaged, right, throughout the whole process, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. You want to start with it, and you definitely want your conclusions and recommendations to have a strategic, not just a tactical side to them.
Interesting. And then, kind of maybe shifting gears a little bit, or maybe it's on a similar stream, but you have a chapter around continuous learning. And I thought that was interesting. So do you mean like continuous learning, like taking what you've learned and continue to apply it? Or are you talking about continuous learning in a different sense?
In multiple senses.
Okay.
Yes, right. I think, with any course, with any book, you learn a lot, you put it aside. If you don't apply it directly to what you're doing, the next time you write a report or have a presentation, at least take some of what I've suggested and maybe start, small and build on that and say, well, how can I make my introduction more interesting? How can I come up with a more essential, deeper kind of learning that really impacts the client, and continuing to do that. But a lot of what I'm talking about is how can you learn on an everyday basis, both in terms of exercises, but also just being aware of how stories are around you. So you're reading an article, ask yourself, why am I reading this article? What got me involved? What got me to keep going? How is it structured? How is it organized? And how does it end? Similarly, you can ask yourself about almost anything. If someone comes in and makes a remark and you want to follow up with probes, you can make it into a real story, or listen to how people relate things to you. Every day of your life is a story. How would you relate this to someone else? Would you focus on one aspect, or would you string it out? How would you make it interesting to this other person who may not care a lot about things? And just by keeping that going, you can become a better storyteller.
I love that. Fred, I think it's probably a good way to wrap this up. Everyone go buy Fred's book, Storytelling and Market Research, A Practical Guide. We put it in the comments. I know I'm going to pick it up, probably buy some for my team too, because I think it's so important. This is really so. Fred, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And
thank you, Dan and Mark. And I greatly appreciate it. And anyone who actually does buy the book, thank you as well.
Awesome.
We all will. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. We'll catch up soon.
Take care.
All right, you too. Awesome. I love the storytelling. It reminds me a little bit of when we had Laura Bright on and she talked about storytelling, but Fred was pretty practical too, which I love. And the answers to his questions. And even if you read his book, the chapters are laid out very fundamentally, I would say.
Very well. And in fact, even from the X day, right? So when Lila was on and she was like, you can't tell your kids data or insights, you tell them stories.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I remember that. Yeah. That we remember the stories, right? Not the calories and the different things
Absolutely. Very, very interesting.
Interesting. Well, I think we can wrap up the show with a few data points here, Mark. I know Tim pulled together some interesting ones here for us, so these will definitely get you thinking.
Nice.
Awesome. So the first one, I didn't know, can you whistle? I guess a little tongue in cheek, about 80% of the people can whistle. I guess 20% can't. So that's kind of interesting there. Can you roll your tongue?
No.
So you have to think about it, huh? So that's another like
Yeah.
70% can, 30% said no, they can't.
I wonder if anyone seeing this actually tried it also. I mean, like I did.
What I'm picturing is people answering these questions and trying it, So
Yeah.
we have people whistling and rolling their tongue. Can you blow a bubble with bubble gum? So most people can there, I'd say.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some fun questions. The next ones kind of get you thinking a little bit more. So Aldi, which is like a grocery store chain here, has launched facial age estimation tech to sell alcohol in new stores, right? So
Oh,
basically when you're checking out, doing, I think, self-checkout, should they sell it or not, should customers have the option to give consent first? So this is interesting.
yeah.
Most people say yes, most people say no, but it's interesting. I think the technology is super interesting there. Where do you
Yep.
stand on this, Mark? Would you say yes or no?
Yeah, I don't think it should be done, but then again, I mean, it's obviously very different everywhere else. And if something like this is done, then McLovin from I forget the name of the movie,
Oh yeah,
but
super bad. Yeah,
yeah, super bad. Yeah, there
yeah.
you go. So I mean, obviously, he would struggle, but no, I don't think that. I mean, it should be without your consent, but that's just me.
But what's interesting is when you walk into a store, most have video cameras, right? So
That's true.
I mean,
That's true.
there's probably some way of giving your consent there, but I think this
That's
might be
true.
taking it a little bit further. Okay, I think a few more questions here. So Peloton has halted its production of bikes and treadmills. Are you worried for the future of subscription workout service? So most people said no, they're not worried about it. I don't think wouldn't be too worried about it either. This next one though, Mark, is an interesting question. So Elon Musk's brain chip firm Neuralink lines up clinical trials in humans. At what point would you consider getting this chip? So this is a chip that I think gets implanted, and then it can automatically relay things to the computer. Like if you wanted to, I'm making it simple, I know, but like open a tab or do this action, do that, and kind of interact without even, having to touch anything. So 70% say never. I think I'm in the never category right now.
Yep. Yep.
It's interesting though, like, 5% say they would immediately do it, but he probably only needs like 30%, market share anyway to
Market
do
share.
this.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
And I'm sure
interesting.
you'll find a way to do it.
It's super interesting to me, like this aspect of things, but scary too. Awesome. Well, go ahead,
Before
Mark.
we end, I know
Yep.
Laura was listening into the show, and I hope Fred sees this too. But this is
Oh,
what
yeah.
Laura said. So I'm so glad that she came on to listen to the show
Oh,
today.
that's awesome. Yeah. Well, we love having Laura as a guest and a listener. So no, thank you for that, Laura. Very much appreciated. Awesome. Well, hey, Mark, I think we can wrap up the show. Thanks, everyone. And be sure to tune in next week as well as we talk about 2022 consumer trends, but more of a Q&A from the last webinar. So with that, have a good week, and we'll see y'all soon.
See you guys.